Hello, this is our first test of the emergency procedures for getting information to you. This is going to be a very short module on the subject of brass mutes. If you are a director of a high school band, you will undoubtedly encounter the use of mutes in music, particularly if you direct a jazz band, and even more importantly, if you have to direct the pit orchestra for a Broadway show. Mutes are an integral part of Broadway show pit productions. And so you need to be familiar with the different kinds of mutes that might be involved and the different kinds of sounds that they produce. Middle school band music typically does not use mutes very often. Occasionally there are pieces that require use of a straight mute. Sometimes jazz bands in the middle school might use a cup mute, but most often, most of the music for middle school is going to be non-muted. So if you would refer to the handout, which is 2 pages, a front and a back, but you'll have it as 2 pages, we will get started. Composers use mutes for 2 reasons: to dampen the sound, to soften the sound of brass, especially when used in conjunction with voice, or to change the color of the brass instrument. Every individual mute has a specific tone color, and composers are very specific about what mute to use in certain situations. For example, in the Boss piece that you played, Heroes, he required the trombones to use 4 different kinds of mutes. Very, very specific, kind of like a Broadway show pit orchestra would use 4 or 5 different mutes. So um, there are there's one primary term that a composer will use to ask for a mute, and that is the Italian term con sordino, or consord for short, the abbreviation. Sometimes you might just see the word sordino printed out, or sword, the abbreviation for sordino, printed underneath or above a certain passage. If consordino or sword is used, then the composer is basically asking you to play the passage with a straight mute. A straight mute is kind of the default mute for the brass players, the most common mute that will be used by brass players. If you're directing a German piece like Mahler Symphony, then typically he would use mit Dämpfer, which is the German equivalent of with mute. Sometimes composers will just simply write with harmon mute, with cup mute, with straight mute, and tell you specifically exactly which mute they want to be used to perform that particular passage. Sometimes you'll just see the term mute, with mute, or mute in which case, again, the default mute would be a straight mute. So let's start with the straight mute. Is the one that is the most common, is the one that would be used if a composer is not specifically asking for a mute such as a cup mute or a harmon mute. You will find straight mutes in orchestra music, in band music, solo music, chamber music, theater music, very rarely in jazz band, but occasionally you might find something in jazz band, but primarily in band and orchestra and solo music. So there are 2 styles of straight mutes available on the marketplace. One is a metal mute, of which Dennis Wick, Joe Rao, and Tom Crown, as you can see on the list, are your most common manufacturers of that metal mute. The second kind of mute, which is available, is a fiber mute, a mute that is made out of basically very hard cardboard. and it is made by Humes and Berg, which is a red and white mute. I will show you an example of that in just a minute. There are plastic mutes out on the market made by Bach, but they're not as plentiful as the metal and as the Humes and Berg, the fiberboard mute. So I've got an example of a metal mute. This is a Joe Rao straight mute for trombone. And as you can hear, it produces a pretty brittle, bright sound. It's not very warm. It's meant to project the sound out into the hall. Metal mutes are not that expensive, and they're quite good. They produce very good sounds, as opposed to the second style. This is a Humes and Berg. You can see it has a red bottom with a white body. This is a bass trombone mute. They are very much cheaper than a metal mute, and so therefore a student is going to go to a store if you don't tell them specifically what to purchase, and more than likely come back with the cheapest model that there is. Humes and Bergs don't project as well as a metal mute because they're cheaper, and you get what you pay for, as the old adage goes. So Humes and Berg fiberboard mutes are not acceptable for what we do here at Stetson University. All of my majors are required when they enter to get a metal mute. And even though in the public school, it might be a bit extreme to insist on a metal mute, a lot of band directors will buy a set of mutes for their whole band and then just check them out to the students as they need. But metal mutes, straight mutes, are not that expensive, $30 to $35 to $45 for a trombone mute, as you can see. So it's not outside of reason to ask a student to buy a good quality straight mute. Where we can fudge on the quality is in the next category, which are cup mutes. Cup mutes also come in two varieties: a metal kind made by Dennis Wick and Joe Rao, and a fiberboard kind made by Humes and Berg, the red and white dot mute. My preference is for metal mutes, although because they're more consistent in quality of sound. But the Humes and Berg does not produce a bad cup mute. And so if I'm going to ask a student to spend $35 on a straight mute, I might, as a compromise, allow them to spend $18 on a Humes and Berg cup mute. Again, cup mutes are not going to be used as commonly as the straight mute, so it's not critical that a student have their own cup mute. Again, most band directors will buy a set of cup mutes for their jazz band or for their symphonic band, and then if the music demands a cup mute being used, they'll just simply check the mutes out for the students. Now, I have a really good, expensive cup mute, which is not made out of metal, by the way, but it's the only quality cup mute I have in my office at the moment. Cup mutes produce a very warm, very warm colored, covered kind of sound, very mellow sound. And this, even though it's not a metal mute, is a very high quality mute. And here is the Humensenberg, red bottom, white body. And again, it's not a bad, it's not a bad sound, but it doesn't have quite the warmth and color that a metal mute will have. So if price is an object, then go with the fiberboard, go with the Humensenberg. If price is no object, then go with the metal mute. All right, turning the page to page number 2, Harman mute. Harman mutes, also known as a wah-wah mute, mainly are going to be used in theater productions, occasionally in contemporary music, solo chamber, occasionally in band. The Boss piece did have Harman mutes for that particular piece, and very rarely will you find a Harman mute in jazz. There's only one type of Harman mute, and that is one that is made out of metal. You can see on the bottom that it has a piece that will come out or slide out of the mute. And what this does, it produces a very nasal sound. All right, which doesn't project as much as a straight mute will. So that's why it's used in Broadway shows. Now, at the end of the mute, you have this open tube. And what you can do with your hand, with your fingers, by opening and closing your hand over the end of the mute, you produce the famous wah-wah sound. And that's where you get the wah-wah mute from. Some of you who may have watched Charlie Brown cartoons when you were younger might recognize that a certain character is present in the cartoons of Charlie Brown, and that is, of course, the teacher. All right, the teacher is literally presented by a trombone with a wah-wah mute or a Harman mute. Again, Harman mutes are a little less common. The composer, if they want the hand to close off the end of the mute, they will use a plus. And if they want the mute hand to be removed from the end of the mute, they will use an O. So you have plus and O, meaning closed and open. And of course, that makes total sense. The next mute that is on the list is primarily for jazz band, a little bit for theater, and some solo, contemporary solo, and that is a plunger mute. Unfortunately, I don't have a plunger mute, but everybody knows what a bathroom plunger looks like. It's a stick with a rubber end, all right, on it. And what you can do in jazz band is take that rubber end, put it over the bell, and then just open and close the plunger mute. And again, you produce basically another wah-wah sound. All right. The final mute that I'm going to talk about tonight is the bucket mute. A bucket mute is primarily used in theater music and jazz band. Sorry about that. I forgot to have one. This is a bucket mute. It is it clips onto the bell, as I'll show you in just a minute, and inside the mute is some absorbent material, cotton or something like that. Bucket mutes. Again, are very mellow in sound and produce a very colorful, covered kind of quality. If you don't have bucket mutes for your jazz band, and again, some band directors who are very serious about jazz band will buy bucket mutes for the trumpets and the trombones, and then use it as necessary. But if you don't have bucket mutes, you can substitute a cup mute and get a very similar type of sound from the section. The last two are primarily jazz related. That is the derby or the hat. That's primarily going to be used in 1920s, 30, 40 big band music. And literally what it looks like is a hat. And you play into the hat for a covered kind of sound. Not many bands, especially public school bands, have derbies any longer. But in the 40s, there was a very, very popular mute. Then the last mute is that is sometimes used in solos as well as jazz. All right, swing music particularly is a clear tone mute. I do have a clear tone mute because I've played a lot of Broadway shows in my career. But if you don't have a clear tone mute, and it's not expected that you would, then you can use a Harman mute as an adequate substitute for the clear tone mute. So straight mutes, very, very common. Good quality is what we want. Metal is what is highly recommended by myself. Cup mutes, Humenberg are fine, although again, here at the university level, I try to ask most of my players, especially the majors, to buy good quality cup mutes. Harman mute is rarely used, but Dr. Phillips is finding music that uses it with much more frequency. And so therefore, I have 4 or 5 in my office that I lend out to the symphonic band when they need it. Those are the 3 primary mutes that a modern day musician must have, unless they do play in a pit orchestra. One last thing, just to be very clear on, is when you insert a mute into an instrument, especially a trumpet, because a trumpet is shorter than a trombone. But when you insert a mute into a trumpet, it's going to raise the pitch of the instrument. The pitch is going to be sharp. So the player has two options to lower the pitch. Either the player can pull the main tuning slide out, which is very easily done in trumpet because the main tuning slide is right in front of your right hand. Or they just simply have to use their lips to change the pitch, lip the pitch down, as we say in the brass world. But when you lip a note down, it changes the instrument color as well as the pitch. The sound becomes a little less resonant, becomes a little bit more stuffy. So my preference for trumpet players is when they have mutes, just simply, if there is time, pull the main tuning slide out just a little bit when they're playing with the mute, and then when they're not, return the main tuning slide back to normal. It's a bit of a pain, and it may not be totally necessary to do, but it is important to realize that mutes change the tuning of the instrument, change the tuning of the melody, and now it is going to be sharp. All right. Um, Wish we had time on Wednesdays that you could play with mutes to get an idea, but unfortunately, we are not doing playing any longer. We're just doing the talking. So, mutes are fun. I love mutes. I've got so many different kinds of mutes in my office. I know some brass teachers that don't like mutes because, as they say, it changes the sound of the brass instrument. But for me, that's exactly why I like mutes, is because I got so many varieties of color that I can use with different colors types of mutes. All right, thanks.